This block is called LeMoyne Star. It's a beautiful block, and one of the reasons why it looks so nice is because these are true diamonds. You can make a similar block with half square triangles. You can see there that these are not. There would be a half square triangle there, but then this shape is different, isn't it? The half square triangle one looks more blocky than this. The true diamonds look much more elegant. But the difficulty with this is that it's not possible to stitch the block in 4 strips as we normally would and then stitch them together, because the seam here does not run through these points. So you can't do this seam all in one. That means it's necessary to stitch Y seams. Can you see? There's a set in seam here and another one here. In fact, there are lots on this block, and they're more tricky to do because you can't just stitch them straight across. Let's have a look at the options we can do for the LeMoyne Star. Sometimes you'll see it done all with the centre pieces in the same colour, but I've done it here with 4 of one colour and 4 of another colour. But there are other options too. We could do it with all 8 points out of different fabrics. I've chosen black and white fabrics here. Let's see if I can arrange them in a pleasing way. Perhaps these are too similar next to each other. Maybe I can swap that one. I think that would be better. Let's make sure it looks good against my choice of background fabric. These are all dark fabrics for the centre, so I've chosen a light fabric for the background. I need 4 squares, and then I need 4 triangles to fill the spaces in. That will leave me with a square block at the end. When you're laying it out like this, by the way, don't worry if it seems not to fit exactly. It will fit properly once we've stitched them all together, because the seam allowances stick out more at the end of these sharp points. It will come right in the end. There, we can see that the whole of the star stands out beautifully against the light background. Here I've got a dark star on a light background. For this one, of course, I had a lighter star against a dark background. These were light and medium fabrics against the dark, but as long as everything shows up against the background, it should look successful. What are the other options I could have? Well, I could repeat a fabric there, and I could repeat the other fabric. I've got 2 of these as well. And what I've decided to try with these is a different colour. So I've got 2 red ones. And I've got a different 2 red fabrics. There. That would also look successful, wouldn't it? So it's possible to have either 8 different fabrics, 4 fabrics with 2 of each, as I've got here, or 2 fabrics with 4 of each. You could also have them all the same, but it might blend together rather too much. It would make quite a solid area in the centre. I think I like it better with 2 alternating colours. Once you've chosen what effect you want, Make sure you look at the pattern carefully to see how many to cut of each colour. I have here a 6 1/4 inch square. This is going to make the triangles on the opposite sides in the centres of the finished block. Those are going to end up with this edge on the outside. So I'm going to cut into 4 pieces like this, and that will give me the straight grain on the outside of the finished block. So all I need to do is put my ruler corner to corner, and then turn it round. I've got a rotating cutting mat which makes that particularly easy. Corner to corner the other direction. Now I have my 4 quarter square triangles. Now I'm ready to cut the diamonds. I've got my strip of red fabric here, which is 3 inches wide. On my project, I'm going to have 2 of this one, 2 of another red one, and 2 each of 2 black fabrics. So I need to cut 2 diamonds out of each fabric. On the instructions, it tells me that for 2 diamonds, a 12-inch strip will be long enough. Look carefully, because for the different numbers, you need different sizes, and it doesn't always double, because you can get proportionately more the more you're cutting out of one strip, because there's only waste at each corner. So the first thing I need to do is to cut off this corner at the right angle, which is 45 degrees. If I put my ruler on top of this white piece of paper, we can clearly see the lines that are on it. Many rulers, like this one, have a number of different lines across. These are labelled 30 degrees. These 2 are the 45 degree lines, and those 2 are the 60 degree lines. You may not have all of those lines on your ruler, but look carefully at the numbers to make sure that you're using the 45 degree lines. So on mine, it's that one and that one. And what you need to do is put the 45 degree line along either the top edge or the bottom edge. You need to place it so that you're going to be able to cut at an angle at this end. So that's right for me. If I put it like that, it would be a bit awkward for me to cut that way round because I'm right-handed. So this is going to be more comfortable. So the 45 degree line along the edge, and then move it sideways until the edge of the ruler is now at the corner of the strip underneath. Cut along the edge of the ruler and discard the waste. Now we need to turn it round. That's easy on my rotating cutting mat. Now I need to move this so that again I have the 45 degree line either at the bottom or at the top, whichever is convenient. It depends where they are on your ruler. And then move it sideways, moving the line along the edge until this line is in the right place. I'm going to cut along this edge, so I need to count 1, 2, 3 inches. That's the line that I need to place over the fresh cut edge that I've just made. At the same time as I've got that 45 degree line along the edge. That will keep my angles correct. Now I can cut my diamond. There, that's the first true diamond, and I now need to cut another one. I've got my fresh cut edge ready, So all I need to do is place it so that the 1, 2, 3 inch line is over my new fresh cut edge, there, and then make sure my 45-degree line is along the edge of the strip. So I've lined it up here, and I've lined it up here, which is 3 inches away from where I'm going to cut. So now I've cut my 8 diamonds. I've chosen to do it with 2 each of 4 different fabrics, alternating between red and black. You can either do just 2 fabrics, or you can even do as many as 8. It's up to you, and you'll get a different effect. But make sure you choose colours that are going to balance each other in the design and which show up against your background fabric. My background fabric is this white, so all of them will show up nicely against it. Before you start stitching, it's a good idea to lay it out, just to make sure you're happy with the arrangement. I'm going to put my black ones opposite each other, and then one of the reds, then the other black, then the other red. I like that, that's going to look good. Let's check it looks right against the background fabric. So I have my 4 squares. These are each 4 inches square. My 4 quarter square triangles that I cut from that larger 6 1/4 inch square. There we are. I'm happy with that arrangement. I think that's going to look good. Before you start stitching them together, the pattern suggests that you make sure you've arranged them in a particular way. Because we've cut them from a straight strip, you'll discover that each of the fabrics has 2 edges on the straight grain and 2 edges on the bias. It's easier to see it on this directional design on this one. And it helps if when you arrange them together, you make sure that a straight grain edge is next to a bias edge, because bias edges always have a tendency to stretch slightly more, and so if it's stabilised by stitching to a straight grain, that'll work better. So on the pattern it tells you to look out and to see, so for instance there is a bias edge, so there is a straight grain edge on the black one, and on this red one there's the straight grain edge and there's the bias edge. So I'm going to be stitching a bias to a straight grain, because that's straight grain, this is the bias, so this wants to stitch onto a straight grain of that one. In the pattern it suggests that you lay it out like this, with the back of the fabric showing, because that's the way you're going to actually see them when you start stitching them together. Now we're ready to start stitching the pieces together. But before that, there's a bit of preparation we need to do, which will help us to line everything up properly. You may be worried when you notice that the edge of the diamond is longer than the edge of the square that it's going to join onto. If I turn over, we can help understand why that is. I've marked on here where the seam allowances are. Can you see? This is the seam allowance on the diamond, and that is the point where the 2 seam allowances cross over. And I've done the same on the square. You'll notice that the square, of course, that is 1/4 inch away in both directions. But on the diamond, it is 1/4 inch away here and here, but because of the shape, there's a much longer point. So it means that the end of the seam is further in. And in fact, if I line that up more closely with that, you'll see that the distance between there and there are in fact the same. So it's very helpful, in fact, to mark these seam allowances on so that we know where to line up. Because we're going to be actually making the Y seams, if you remember, we're going to be sewing them like this. You need to make sure that we stitch these seams doing something that you may have done when you're hand sewing, but you probably don't normally do when you're machine sewing. We need to stop sewing at this point, the end of the true seam, and not stitch across into the seam allowance. That means because we're going to need to manipulate the fabric here to make sure we can stitch all of these seams accurately and neatly. And it's much easier to do that if we've not stitched across the seam allowance. Also, doing this will help us to line up correctly the places that should be joined together. So we need to put these marks on all the corners that will be joined together. And the first thing you need to do is to make sure you've got a marker that will show up clearly but will not soak through to the other side of the fabric. So why not test out on some of the scraps of fabric that you've made? I've got a selection of different coloured pencils here, which are my favourites. You'll see details of these in the marking methods part of the techniques section of my website. Try them out, see which ones show up well. So for example, that pink works quite well on the back of that black and white fabric, but of course it doesn't show up very well on the red. Bright green is surprisingly good. Yeah, that's quite good on the black, and it's quite good on the red as well. This yellow quilter's pencil is also good on dark fabrics, not quite so good on the red. This is a silver one, not so good on there, but it does show up well on here. And this white, well, it shows quite well on the red part, but not on the white, not on there, but on this plain back fabric it shows up beautifully. So try out various different ones and see which colour is going to show up best on the back of your fabric. Don't use an ordinary biro, by the way, or something that might soak through to the other side. So if I get my square, how do I mark it a 1/4 inch in from the edge? Well, there are all sorts of ways of doing this, and I'm going to show you some of the possibilities. One way is to take a small ruler, and if you line the 1/4 inch mark up with the edge of the fabric, you can just run your pencil alongside it. You don't need to mark all the way along. You could do it if you wanted to. Turn it round, line up against the edge on the 1/4 inch line again. It usually marks more clearly, by the way, if you move your pencil up and down like this. It stops the fabric stretching, which is what can sometimes happen if you try and press really hard and just go in one direction like that. There, now I've got all my 4 corners marked on that one. So that's one method of doing it. Alternatives are one of these, which is a quilter's quarter, which you may have, or even some gridded template plastic. You could cut a narrow 1/4 inch strip from that, or even a little corner like that. They all do the same job. Line up against the edge. Make sure that your pencil is right against it, by the way. Your pencil will always be drawing slightly further away from the edge, particularly depending on what angle you're holding it at. So point it right in, make sure it's sharp. In fact, my pencils are all sharpened so that they're like a wedge. They're wide one way and narrow the other way. I sharpen them like that with a craft knife. You'll see I've done the same on this yellow. It's narrow that way and wide that way. That's because the chalk that's in these quilters' pencils is sometimes quite fragile, and it can break easily if you sharpen it using an ordinary pencil sharpener. Doing it like this gives it more strength, but still allows drawing a nice narrow fine line. This type, which are propelling pencils, also give a good fine line, and of course they don't need sharpening. Let's try the pink, see if that shows up well on here. Yes, that leaves a good line. We need to do the same on the triangles, and it can be a little bit more awkward to get the sharp points right on these and also on the diamonds. One other method you might like to try is to use 1/4 inch masking tape. This is often available not only in this beige colour, but if you search hard you can find it in this dark green too. Obviously the dark green would show up better on this pale fabric. And what you can do is tear very small sections of this and place them along the edge. That will instantly show you where the 1/4 inch point is. You can either leave the masking tape on like that, or you can use it, mark your line against it, and then remove it. Be careful which way you pull it, because you don't want to distort the bias edges. Of course, you can use the same pieces of masking tape several times. And if you also use them to stick down onto the surface that you're working on here, that will help hold it still while you draw against the edge. There's 2 of the corners marked. Now I'll do the 3rd one. There. Now I've got the 1/4 inch point marked clearly on all 3 corners, and I need to do the other 3 the same. And then, as you can see here, I need to do the same on my diamonds. You may discover that in amongst all the things you've bought at quilt shows over the years, you have 1 or 2 things that might also be used to do this. For example, you might have a template like this, which has holes marked in it. And the idea is that you can put your template against the corner and mark through it. When I try and do this against my diamond though, you'll see a problem. This template is for a 60-degree diamond, and this is a 45-degree diamond. So this marking template is not suitable. 45-degree ones seem much more difficult to find. You may also have window templates like this. There's a diamond. Would that work? Well, unfortunately, that's also the wrong angle. That's also the one that fits with the hexagons. So those are no good for me to use today. If you do find a 45-degree one, then you can use it in a similar way to mark all the corners. I do find it easier, by the way, to draw 2 lines so that I can see the crossover point clearly. Some of those templates where you just put a pencil through a hole leave a very small dot, and I don't find those as easy to see. So I'm going to have to do this using my 1/4 inch ruler or my masking tape. Again, be gentle there because it's a bias edge. I don't think this green shows up as well as the blue. I'll use this instead. There. Now I've got the crossover points marked on all the points of the diamond. I just now need to do the same on all my others. Now we need to lay out the pieces in the correct order so that we're ready to start stitching. It tells you in the instructions to do this with the wrong side of the fabric face up, because that will make it easier to pick them up and place them and to follow the diagrams that I have. If you have essentially 2 colours, like I've done, where one is darker and one is a medium shade, try to lay them out exactly as is shown in the diagrams, because then all the diagrams will have the dark and the medium in the correct place, which will help stop you getting in a muddle. So when we lay out the whole star, for instance, put the darker one on the left at the top and the medium one on the right at the top. And then continue round with the colours as shown on the diagram. And then place the squares in the corner. And the triangles in the side. You'll notice on the diagram like this, it also shows whether you've got the bias edge or the straight grain edge in certain places. These diamonds, because of the way we've cut them, have all got 2 straight grain edges and 2 bias edges. Now you'll notice, of course, that one of the edges meets the next diamond. Stitching 2 straight grain edges together is not a problem, but stitching 2 bias edges is likely to lead to something stretching. I've arranged it so that we've always got a straight grain against the bias edge of the next one. That will help stabilise those bias edges when we stitch them together. And my diagrams in the pattern show you how to stitch it always with the bias edge on the top, because that will help control the stretching even better. It's these little tips which will help you get a more accurate result. Now I'm going to start stitching this Y seam here. So I'm going to take those 3 pieces, and in fact I'm just going to slide all of the others out of the way for now so that they stay in the same arrangement. And these are the ones that I'm going to work on. I'm comparing the layout of the pieces with the diagram on the instructions, and I'm making sure that I have the dark one on the left, the medium one on the right, and the light triangle at the top. Notice that it tells you on the instructions by diagram and in the words which one to stitch first and a suggested direction. So it suggests that we stitch this seam first in that direction, then the second seam also towards the centre, and then last of all stitch the 2 diamonds together like that. So the first seam I need to stitch is between the light triangle and the dark diamond. So I pick them up and place them right sides together. Because the outer edges are both the same angle, I can just line those up. But I need to be more careful at this end. Don't worry that the edges don't match. That's because the angle of the diamond is different to the angle on the triangle. What I need to do is put a pin through the crossover point here, and it should come out at the crossover point at the back. If it doesn't quite, just move it and adjust it a little bit until it does. Poke the pin right through and then turn back to this side. You'll see that I've got a little ripple here. Now this point is more important than the outer point. So keep the middle one correct. There. An imperceptible difference, but now it lies flat. Don't be tempted to twist this pin round like that, by the way, because sometimes that can make the relative position move. Push it right through to the head, and then with another pin, put the pin in before and bring it out afterwards along the line that we've drawn. Now we can take that out and pin the centre. We're now ready to stitch this seam. Because this point here is going to be on the outside of the block, remember that's how it's going to go together, then we can stitch right from the end. But here we need to stop stitching at the crossover point here. When we put these three together, remember for the next seams we're not going to be able to stitch straight across easily, and we need to be able to manipulate this point to manoeuvre these so that the next two seams can lay flat. And it will help to do this if we don't stitch over the last bit of the seam allowance here, if we stop stitching there. And that means that when we stitch it, we need to make sure that we finish our stitching in a way that will not come undone. So what I'm going to do is stitch with an ordinary stitch length for most of it. When I approach the crossover point, I'm going to reduce the stitch length for the last bit. That will allow me to stop exactly on here, and if my stitches are very, very close together, then that means that they won't come undone when I cut the thread. You may have a fix stitch on your machine which does the same job for you, but check it properly first, because some of them leave a rather nasty lump of thread on the back. We don't want that at this point that we need to manipulate and lie flat. So now we're going to stitch the diamond onto the triangle, starting at the outside edge. So we can stitch right from the edge of the fabric . You're actually stitching two bias edges together here on both the triangle and the diamond, so stitch slowly and carefully. As we approach the final crossover, have a look at where the line is and make sure that that's in line with your needle, Just adjust the angle slightly if necessary to make sure that you are going to stitch onto the line. And as we approach the final crossover here, we need to reduce the stitch length as we approach it. I can go a little bit nearer first. And now make my stitch length a bit shorter, and then even shorter as I approach the final. This means I can see it really clearly and make sure that my last stitch is ending exactly where I want it to. Perhaps one more. There we go. There. You can see how my stitching gets smaller and smaller and then stops exactly on the crossover point here. So now I can simply snip the threads. Can you see? I've stopped exactly at the crossover point on the back too. And that will mean that I can now manipulate this seam allowance around different ways when I want to stitch the next part. So we've just stitched this dark diamond onto the light triangle at the top. Now we're going to stitch the medium diamond and stitch this seam on the other side of the triangle. We've arranged it so that that is the straight grain of this diamond. So if we put that underneath, we can have the bias edge of the triangle on top, which will help to keep everything stable. The other advantage of having the triangle on the top is that it means that we can stitch and see the previous seam that we've just done, and we can see the end of it. That's where we want to stitch this new seam, and we can see to stop exactly on there. If we stitched it from the back, although we've got the crossover point, we can't tell exactly where the previous stitching was, and if we made any slight errors, we can't adjust for it. If you're lining it up right, it should look like the diagram on the instructions, with the dark diamond on the top, the medium diamond poking out underneath, and the light triangle on top. And remember, we're going to stitch it that way as it's shown on the diagram by the arrow. So our pins are going to be this way round, so we start here and stitch like that. The end of the triangle and the end of the diamond are the same shape, so we can line those up just normally. But then here we have to be sure that our crossover points are matching at the top of the Y seam. So poke a pin right through the very end of the first seam you've just stitched, which of course should be where it crosses over that line here. And then check that it's going exactly through the crossover point on the back. If it's very slightly out, move it until it comes through where those two lines cross. Poke it right through to the other side. Now we want to make absolutely sure we're not catching any of this as a pleat in our seam. So pull that right to the side and make sure that that pin goes right down into the ditch. And with a new pin, pin that seam allowance and trap it so it's down. If you want to, you can always put another pin down here just to make sure things don't slip and move out of the way. Now we can take this one out and we can use it to finish pinning our seam along here. So we can start stitching right at the very edge because that's the outside of the edge of the block, stitch right along here, and we're going to stop exactly at that point. Remember, we're not going to stitch across the seam allowance here. And as we did before, we're going to start slowing down about here, reduce the stitch length so that we can go slowly and accurately, and stop there, fixing the stitch so that we can then just cut the threads off. So now we're ready to stitch this second seam. Start right at the very edge. If you do see any slight ruckling up of the bias edge, just use a tool to hold that flat while you approach it. Make sure you're heading for that line. And as you approach, remember, we now need to stop stitching at this crossover point here. So when I'm about 1 centimetre away, I'm going to start reducing the stitch length. A bit smaller again. And right down to a really tiny stitch for the last few, so that I can be sure to stop in exactly the right place. There. And you see, my stitch line stops exactly at the crossover point, so I can snip the thread. Turn over and look at the back before you snip the final thread, just to see whether your stitching has been accurate. Mine is just actually slightly above the line. So let's have a look and see. Oh, it's still quite a good point. Can you see? I have stitched right to the final seam. If I hadn't quite got it right and there was a little gap, it would be a good idea to cut a slightly longer thread for one of the machine threads, either the top or the bottom thread. And then if necessary, I could thread an ordinary needle onto that and put in 1 or 2 stitches by hand to close up the gap if I hadn't quite stitched it to the right place. So now, looking at it from the back, we have the dark one stitched onto the left of the triangle and the medium one stitched onto the right of the triangle. Now we're going to stitch the third of the seams to make the Y seam. And we're going to stitch this one with the bias edge on top, which is the edge on the medium diamond. Pick it up and manipulate it round. This is where you can see the advantage of not having stitched across the seam allowances here. If you had done, you wouldn't be able to get it into the right position. We need to make sure that our new seam starts at the very end of this line of stitching, which of course should be at the same place as the very end of this line of stitching on the back. And it's a good idea to pull that triangle out of the way like that and pleat it in the middle, and to make sure that that is completely opened up underneath so that nothing gets caught. Put a pin right through the end of the stitching line, and it should come out right at the end of the stitching line underneath. If it doesn't, adjust the position slightly. You can see that my stitching line on the dark in the position of this one, it'll mean it starts just very slightly above where it should do, but the point will meet at the Y seam, which is the more important thing. So poke your pin right through to the head and then line up the two edges of the diamonds. Now, mine isn't quite lined up here because of the slight mistake I made, but it doesn't matter because this is where I'm going to make the adjustment. I should still be able to line up the two edges at the points. But again, if I do need to make an adjustment, I can make it here because the Y seam is the place where the mistakes are going to be least easy to correct. That's now going through right to the head, and I'm going to put a pin a bit further down to make sure I keep everything over here well out of the way. And then I'm going to again put a pin. It's going to go through the seam allowance, even though I'm not going to stitch that part, but it'll keep it out of the way. If I put my pin in line with where I need the seam to go, through there, that will give me something to aim for when I'm stitching, because I can see that the pin is where I need to stitch. There, that's all ready for me to stitch this seam in the way I've stitched the others. Starting right at the end and stopping at the point where the previous seam's finished. So for the third seam, again, line up with the edge of your 1/4 inch foot as usual. And start to stitch. Now, if you remember, I had to adjust the position of the seam here. It's a little bit out this way rather than being on my original line, so that I was going to get the point in the right place for the Y seam. I've got my pin in the correct place. I need to make sure that I'm aiming my stitching exactly for the line of the pin. And only pull the pin out slowly so that I can see the position as long as possible. And as before, as I approach the point where I need to stop, I need to make my stitching shorter. And shorter again, and make sure I'm aiming for the very end of the previous stitching line. There, that should be it. And if I look, that stitching line matches on that side perfectly, so I can cut this thread. Don't cut the other one yet. Wait until you've seen on the other side. Does that match well? Yes, it does. So I can also cut the thread on that side. If I hadn't quite stitched to match it, I could have used that thread to do a bit of hand stitching, just to close up the gap. Let's have a look. Yes, that's given me a very nice Y seam which matches perfectly. One of the ways we can make sure that all the 8 points of these diamonds meet beautifully in the middle is to think about the way we press the seams on the back. You can see that I've managed to do it in a way which reduces the bulk at the centre, and also so that the seams meet pressed in opposite directions so that we can line them up better. To do this, we need to make sure that all the seams spiral around the centre in the same direction. The sections we've just made are these sections here. So that seam needs to be pressed to the right, looking at it from the back. So now we're ready to press this. So with this one, we're going to press that seam in that direction. So from the front, we start off on top of the dark and push away over the medium, opening out that seam. These two are going to be pressed down. So turn it round, put the iron on the triangle and push out over the medium diamond to open that seam out, and then the side of the iron again pushing open that seam. A little bit of steam, and you can see that we have the Y seam perfectly as we would wish on the front and on the back. The next stage is to stitch a square onto the side of each of these pieced units that we've just made. Make sure that you're laying it out as shown in the instructions, and those all show with the reverse side uppermost, so I can see the seams here, so I know it's the wrong side, and the same for the square, and the square is on the right of the medium diamond. This is a bias edge, and this is a straight grain edge. So again, we're going to pin and stitch with this edge on the top to control the bias stretch more easily. So pick it up and turn it round, and we need to make sure we're lining up our crossover points on the front and on the back here, and also at the outside edge as well. So poke a pin through the crossover point, and through the crossover point on the back, push it right through, and the same here. One of the reasons we pressed this seam down like that was to make sure that we could clearly see the crossover point here. If we'd pressed it that way, of course, it would have been hidden. So through this crossover point, and then through the one on the square at the other side. Hopefully it should now lie flat. If it doesn't quite, make sure you get this one right as a priority. You can get away with a slight adjustment on the outside edge of the block more easily than you can at the Y seam. So with that pushed right through, we now put a pin along the line that we've drawn through the crossover points. Try to put this pin in line with where the head of that pin is, because that will help us to stitch straight, and make sure we stitch through the crossover point, because we've already stitched that seam, don't forget, and we want to make sure that when we stitch it, we get a good point on the other side. There. Now we're ready to stitch again, right from the edge, along here, and then stopping at the crossover point with a fixed stitch as we did last time. So now I'm going to stitch this seam that I've just pinned. as before, aim for the pin, which shows me where the crossover point here. And as we get closer, we reduce the stitch length. Smaller again. And stop stitching once you're exactly on the crossover point. There. And then we can just cut the thread right up against it. So we've just stitched our square onto the side of this section. As you can see, so we've just stitched a square onto the side of the 2 diamonds in the triangle section we'd just made, and it's going to fit here into the finished block. So we now need to decide which way we're going to press this seam. The choice I've made is actually a compromise involving several different things. Let's have a look at this square. If we look at the outside edge, there is an advantage of pressing this seam towards the square if we look at the outside edge. Where those 2 seams cross over forms the point of this diamond as seen on the other side. So when the block is eventually stitched into a finished project, we need to stitch this seam here, and if we can see that crossover point and aim to stitch straight through it, we'll get a really good point on the other side. But if we pressed both of those seams towards the square, it would make a very bulky junction here. So it's better to press one way and one the other way, and then in fact we can make the seam allowances at this point spiral round and open them out like this. That really reduces the bulk and helps to keep that flat. And as we've decided to press all of these seams of the diamonds going round in a spiral so that they can make a neat low bulk centre in a few minutes, if we've got this seam this way and that seam that way, we want to make this seam that we've just stitched press towards the diamond. So to press that seam towards the diamond, it's better to do it from this side and open it up, making sure the seam allowance is going that way, with the side of the iron on top of the square, then push away, and then we have the seam pressed where we want it. So now we've made 4 pieces like this, with the piece section with the diamonds and the triangle attached to a square. Now we're ready to go on to the next step. Remember, the diagrams always show everything from the back. So if I lay these 4 out, you'll see now how they need to join together. And we're going to go and join together 2 and 2 to make pairs, and then after that we'll join that long seam to finish the block. So now we have 2 of these sections that we've just made, and we need to stitch this seam to join them together. But of course it's not a straight seam, it's part of another Y seam, isn't it? The instructions tell you to first of all stitch that seam in that direction, and then secondly to stitch the seam between the 2 diamonds up towards the Y seam join again. So we're going to stitch this one first. Which seam should we have on top? Well, in fact we've got both straight grain here, so from that point of view we could have either, but actually it's easier to stitch with the square on top. Because we've pressed this seam away from the square, it means that this corner is now nicely exposed. So if we stitch with the square uppermost, we can stitch along here and see really clearly where that crossover point is that's going to be at the top of the Y seam. That's the one we're going to line up first. So go through the end of the previous line of stitching with your pin and through the crossover point on the diamond on the back. You should just be able to line those up well like that at the end. Put a pin in here through the seam allowance. Although we're not going to stitch right through the seam allowance, it means it holds all this nicely out of the way to make sure we don't trap any of this in that seam. Now we're ready to stitch again right from the edge, slowing down and stopping exactly on the crossover point. So I'm now going to stitch the first of these two seams. Start stitching at the edge. Make sure you're stitching towards the line of the pin, which is showing me where that corner point is. And make sure that this is flipped out of the way so that you can stitch right into the corner. Don't stitch across the seam allowance. And as you approach the corner, reduce the stitch length. And smaller still. So that you can stop stitching right at the end of the previous stitching line. There. That's a good join. So now we've sewn the first of the two seams that will join these two quarters together, and we've already decided that that one will have to press towards the square so that we can get that swirl around in a moment. So turn it over and have it with the square on the top, and with the side of the iron go over the diamonds and press towards the square. There. Now we're ready to do the final seam here. So we've now stitched this, which is the first seam which joins these two quarter sections together. Now we're going to stitch the other seam joining the diamonds. This diamond has a straight grain edge, this diamond has a bias edge, so we're going to stitch with the bias edge on top. So fold it, fold the corner square along the diagonal so that it keeps out of the way, and now we're going to pin this seam here. Poke a pin right through the end of this line of stitching and make sure you come out at the crossover point at the end of this line of stitching here. Poke it right through. Here, because both of these seams have been pressed in opposite directions, you should be able to shuffle it flat so that those seams nest nicely. Make sure the whole of this seam can lie flat. There. And then this pin will hold those in place. Here, put a pin through the seam allowances on both the front and the back, just to keep those pinned out of the way. We don't want any of this getting trapped in that Y seam. There. Now, as is becoming familiar, we can start right at the end and stitch, making the stitch length smaller as we stop right at the crossover point here. And now to stitch this second seam, this important Y seam. Now reduce the stitch length gradually. And shorter again. Keep this seam allowance just out of the way so that you can see the edge of the end of the previous seam and aim for it. One more. There. My two stitching lines meet well on this side. Let's have a look at the back. That goes to the crossover point as well. Remember, if you didn't quite get as far as you meant to, just cut and leave a longer end of the machine thread so that you can take a couple of stitches by hand. Mine's okay, so I can just snip it off. So we've just stitched the seam between the diamonds, and we now need to press this one this way. And can you see that because we've already decided the pressing direction of those, this can open up here because we didn't stitch right to the end, and you can just allow it to fall open like that. And then when we press it, that will give us a nice way of reducing the bulk there. So we need to press this towards the dark diamond. Don't press right up to there. We're going to do that on the other side, but we need to press this from that side to make sure it's well opened. And then on the back, just manipulate that with your fingers, and you can press that little rosette open. There. That's a nice flat point, and we can make sure we've got a lovely Y seam on the other side. Now we have the two halves ready to stitch together. We're going to stitch this seam in 3 sections. We'll stitch the centre one first, because the centre of this star is the point where we want to be most careful about lining everything up to get a really crisp centre. You'll notice that as we've pressed all of the seams on the diamonds spiralling round the centre, that means that when we put them together like this, the seams will go that way on the back and this way on the front. So it means that we can nest all 3 pairs and get a perfect line-up. So shuffle it between your fingers and make sure that these 2 seams and that seam and this one are nested opposite, and these as well. It may take just a little bit of manoeuvring to get it to sit flat on all 3 of those seams. Here, and here, and here. When you've achieved that, put a pin through. Hopefully, if you put it on the stitching line that you marked earlier, it will be right. But that will only be right if your 2 stitching lines here and your marked line here all intersect. If they don't, go with the stitching lines, even if it means that you move your intended seam line in or out a little bit. It doesn't actually matter whether the seam allowances are exactly 1/4 of an inch on the back, as long as it looks right on the front. Let's see. That's not bad, is it? Let's try again. So when you have all of those three lined up perfectly, put a pin in. I would advise you to put the pin and the stitching line in a moment just fractionally into the seam allowance side, just a little bit beyond where these two stitching lines cross over. Really, the stitching line should go through and intersect these, but because you've got so many thicknesses of material, you may find that forms a perfect point very slightly down in the ditch where we won't see it. So in fact, if we turn to the other side and open it up, you can see that that is going to form a very good star point on this side. Over here, we need to line up the crossover point that we marked here with the crossover part marked on that diamond. And also at this end here. The crossover point for this one. Flip that and find the crossover point underneath. There. There. Let's see if we get a good line up on the other side. Yes, it's a bit difficult to tell until we've stitched it, but that looks as though it's going to form a good centre. Prioritise the centre. If that means that you can't make these lie exactly flat, just adjust the position of the end of this a little bit. It's possible to adjust here much more easily than it is to adjust here. Now we're ready to stitch this. From the crossover point here, don't stitch over the seam allowance of course, carefully through the centre and stop at the crossover point here. If you're worried about getting this centre right, what you can do is stitch a longer stitch length over here, and if it's right, stitch over it again afterwards. So now we're ready to stitch this long seam across the centre of the star points. For the first time, we're going to need to start with a fixed stitch at this point, as well as finishing with a fixed stitch. So remember to make your stitch length very short to start with. And then maybe manually put your needle down to make sure it's exactly at the end of the previous stitching line. There it is. and then start stitching with a few very small stitches and gradually lengthen until you're back at your normal stitch length. Make sure that you're aiming for the end of your pin. And if you're worried about getting this centre point right, this is the place to start lengthening your stitch length to the maximum your machine will do. Then, as you stitch across it, it'll be easier to unpick if it's not right. But still stitch slowly, and when you get to the centre, take the pin out very carefully and use something to hold those seam allowances nice and nested flat against each other. Remember that you want to aim to stitch not exactly through the crossover of the previous seams, but just slightly into the seam allowance side. Once you're over the bulky seam centre, go back to your normal stitch length . And now, of course, we need to reduce our stitch length again as we approach our second crossover point. And smaller again. There. Now let's cut the threads off. And let's have a look to see how we did at the centre. Can you see? My long stitches are just a little into the seam allowance. Have I got the star point I want? Well, these are a little bit further apart, so in fact I do need to stitch the seam a little bit tighter. But the advantage of stitching into the seam allowance side means that I can now stitch another seam line and I don't have to unpick that one. So let's try adjusting it a little bit more. Start stitching exactly on top of your previous seam line. And where you went a little bit this way, I'm now going to stitch about halfway in between my marked line and my stitched line. But again, I'm going to do a very long stitch. And back to my normal stitch length. Let's see if that's better. Can you see? I've just moved the stitching line a tiny fraction. That's a lot better, isn't it? That looks pretty good. I could perhaps take it in just a tiny bit more, but then that'll be just right. So this time I think I can stitch it with my normal stitch length because I know exactly where I want to go. I want to go just about a thread's width to this side again. Those are really good points at the centre of my star. So now I've stitched this seam across the middle section. And in fact there's a trick that I can do before I press it, which make it easier to reduce the bulk and get a flat section where so many fabrics join together. If you look at this one that I've already finished, this is the final seam across here. And you can see that I've made these spiral round. The only way I can do that is to make this seam press this way and that seam press the other way. And I can't do that at the moment because the seam goes right across. The only way I can do it is to unpick the last few stitches on this seam on both sides. Just down to the seam junction, and the same on this one. Don't cut the threads, just leave them. But now I'll be able to press this one this way, that one that way, and I'll be able to manipulate all those seam allowances to spiral out nicely when I press it. So now I'm ready to press these two seams. If I feel the others, that goes that way and that way and that way. So I want the seams to spiral round that way. So this is the one that I need to press away. Turn it round, and then this one wants to go away as well. So now in the centre, that's where I've got my little spiral. So press that on both sides. And that gives us as flat as possible for that beautiful star point in the centre. So now I'm ready to stitch the final two seams here. Each one, of course, is the third leg of a Y seam, so I do them just the same as the ones I did over here. Twist it round so that you've got the square on the top. So that it's lying flat. Make sure you've got the end of this seam and the end of that seam, and that both the seam allowances are moved out of the way because we don't want to trap those in our new seam. It might help when you put this pin in to make sure that you trap the seam allowances so that they're not going to get caught in the seam. And as usual, I'm going to start on the outside, stitch along here, reduce the stitch length to stop exactly on the crossover point here. And I'll do the same, the one on this side as well. So the final seams start at the edge. Aim for the pin and pull it out gradually, because remember it's also doing the job of holding the seam allowances out of the way on the back and the front, so that we can stitch right to the crossover point without stitching over either of the seam allowances. So leave it till the last minute to withdraw the pin, pull it out slowly while you stitch with smaller stitches. Reduce the stitch length right down. There. We've stitched right to the crossover point on the front, and it's met the other line of stitching at the back. Remember, if yours doesn't meet perfectly, cut it with a longer thread so that you can add 1 or 2 stitches by hand. But mine's okay, so I'll just snip it off. Then I'll do the same for the last seam on the other side. So that's the seam I've just stitched, and we can see that as we manage to make those spiral round, we're going to do the same here. So that one wants to press that way so that we can get that little spiral here. So we press that way. And then make sure we get that at the back. And the same with this one here, wants to go that way. Manipulate our little spiral and then give the whole block a final press. And we have a beautiful LeMoyne star.